No. No.
All right. Welcome back, guys. I hope that your bladders are empty and the urge to make obscene things in the chat have slightly declined. Although I don't really care, so it's cool. Okay. There's luckily you guys have not been able to infect my local server with all of the things. Oh my gosh. Oh, I like that. I like that. Okay, cool. And you even know how to do the little curly things above the end. That is hard to do sometimes for a gringo like me. Okay, so I'm going to open up, just to recap, we ended up like deploying an app that used what we call blueprints in Sails and did a quick little Angular prototype on the front end in the last segment. Just to reiterate, I mean, you could use any front end. There's something called the Sails stack, which I saw some people were talking about because it's awesome. And I honestly just haven't used Ember as much. That's something that I'm trying to change a little bit because I want to at least have a high level understanding about all the things. But realistically, there's so many good front end frameworks out there that it's a lot to hold in your head. So, pick whichever one you like. You could do this with jQuery, you could do it with Angular, you could do it with React, you could do it with Ember. It would all be fine. It's all completely valid. As long as it's stuff is JavaScript, it'll work. Okay, so what we're going to do next is dive a little bit deeper into the meat of Sails and get down to, okay, what do all these folders really mean? What are they here for? And then if we wanted to just turn off the magic, what's actually happening behind the scenes? So I'm going to open up my app again. It's still called foobar there. I need to close these tabs. And if I pop it open in Sublime, you'll see, and let me know if that's too small to read on the left there, and I can do it in Finder. But there's a few top-level folders. There's API, assets, config, tasks, and views. And then there's some files. There's these hidden files here that start with a dot. There's editor config, git ignore, Sails.rc. Editor config is just a thing that you can throw in any project that is kind of a conventional way to specify your, whether you like spaces or tabs, or whether it's 2 spaces or 4 spaces or whatever you want. Git ignore is telling Git not what to keep and what not to keep when you actually push stuff up to the repo. The Sails.rc is a way for you to configure stuff at a high level. So this file takes priority over most of your other configuration. This is particularly useful if you have hundreds of Sails apps on your system like I do, and you want to be able to set up your default generators. So if you're using Ember, for instance, you might want to have some special generators that will create Ember modules from along with the APIs that you're creating with Sails. Same thing for React. Same thing for Angular. You might have Sails generate directive, that sort of stuff. So that's what those are about. App.js is just here because like any good Node app, you've got to have some entry point. So this is actually what is running when we deploy this to Heroku. When we're running it with Sails lift locally, it's not actually running this file. It's just starting it up itself. But this file is programmatically starting up Sails. So I saw there's some questions about unit testing. Like if you were going to write some unit tests, you would definitely want to start with what you see in this file or look for some examples online. And you're going to require Sails and then lift it programmatically. So you would just call Sails.lift like that. And you can pass a callback to it, and then you'll be able to wait till it's done. So you put that in like your Mocha before, right? So we'll come back to that talk later in the Q&A. Grunt file, same idea. There's actually most of the grunt stuff in Sails lives in the tasks folder conventionally, but the grunt file is the entry point that grunt expects to find. You don't have to use grunt. You can use gulp if you like gulp. You can use any kind of automation system you want, or just turn this off by disabling the hook. But by default, we do this because it works and it's good. So there it is. You don't ever really have to look at this too much because what you actually get to do is look in the tasks folder And we'll come back to that later, and I'm going to mainly let you guys drive that in Q&A if you want, rather than getting too deep into Grunt right now. So the next thing is the package.json file. Again, like any good Node app, we've got some dependencies, some basic metadata about the project. So the name is still set to foobar. We probably ought to change that to emobook. Private true is there, so I don't accidentally publish this on npm, which is easy to do, right? Because all you have to do is type npm publish. But what you'll see is it's going to give me a big error, and it's going to say, hey, you've got private on this. You can't do that right now. And why would we want to? It's an app, right? So there's a few other things. Something good to know is this main. This tells different, basically anyone that's deploying your app where to look to start it. And so that's that entry point file. And this repository is just a link to the actual repository we're using. We're not actually using foobar. We're using emobook. So I'm going to update that. And then license is blank because this might be a secret app that's under a special proprietary license, or it might be MIT licensed and open source. Sails is MIT licensed and open source. Okay, so that's kind of the basics there. readme.md is pretty useless to us right now, but this is where you could throw whatever you want. Again, it's just a convention that you'll see in a lot of apps that end up getting put on GitHub. I like to put like the basic instructions to getting started with the app in here. Right now, all you do is run sales lift, so that's why it says sales application. Okay, so a little bit more of a tour. And we already looked at the assets folder a little bit. I'll let you guys tell me if there's anything you want to talk about more in there. But the API folder is where most of your backend code lives. And this is stuff like controllers, which are basically little buckets of functions that handle different routes. So if you go to a specific URL or you hit a URL with Ajax, these things run. These things we call actions. So a controller will have a handful of actions, and those all live in the controllers folder. And what happened before when we ran Sails generate API emoji is it created emoji controller.js and emoji.js, these two things. So here's emoji controller. Here's emoji.js, and you can see it has some attributes. Basically, those are like fields in your database or columns in an Excel spreadsheet or something like that, right? This is where you store stuff. So in here we have nothing right now, which is actually fine because we have what we call schema set to false. So schema is this flag that you can put on any model, or you can put at the in the models.js file here by default. And so it's actually going to default to using whatever the adapter supports. Right now we're using the Sails disk adapter. The adapter is just like a tube that you can like plug in to something, right? I mean, if you imagine this little guy on my phone here, this if you have like an old iPhone charger, you might need an adapter to plug it into this. It's the same way with Sails adapters. If you have Sails, Sails MySQL adapter, that means that your app can use MySQL. And the actual, what's actually happening is it's connecting Waterline to that database, but we can talk about that more later. So we didn't need any attributes so far, but we could add some because it's better actually to have these in here, and it helps protect you from inadvertently storing weird stuff. So we know we have something called text. And you probably saw before that we have created at, updated at, and ID. I'm just going to leave those out because those are implicit in every model in Sails, just like they are in Rails and other frameworks like this, because a lot of times you end up needing that information, and you always need some kind of like unique identifier for a record, right? And that's what we call each entry in these models is a record. So a model is kind of like an Excel spreadsheet. The records are like the individual rows in the spreadsheet, and attributes are like columns in the spreadsheet. That's simple. So text is one of those columns / attribute, and we're going to name it text. We're going to give it a type string, and this is, for example, something like that. That's pretty much it, right? So that's cool. Let's make sure, we made a change and it's still early on. Let's make sure that our app still works. So we're going to lift it. Going to open it back up in the browser. and everything is still there, which is good news. Okay, so next up is why, we see why this model is here. It's sort of to tell us what the structure of the data is going to be that we're storing. What is this controller? Well, it's empty right now. What's actually happening behind the scenes is that there is a find, create, update, and destroy, and also find one. Actions, right? So these are each actions. They're there, right? They're always there, whether we like it or not, these particular ones, as long as there's a model with the same name. And this is just something that Sails does for you. They're called blueprint actions. And it's because generally, like, if not in the final product, at least for a while when you're developing an app, it's super handy to have these things around, because then you can just go fake some data real quick. So I'm just going to leave them in here commented out for reference, and I'm going to drop this file into the little chat deal for you, so that so you can kind of play with it and mess around with it if you want on your end. And I'll do the same thing for the model. Also, I just think this thing's really cool, so I like dropping stuff in there. All right. So to continue our tour, and just real quick, those little .git keep files, they mean absolutely nothing. They're just there because Git as a protocol doesn't support folders, right, by themselves. So it also doesn't support capitalization, which may have burned you in the past. I can think of several times in my life where I've taken to drinking because of that. But anyways, the git keep files, no big deal. They just keep the folders around. The other three folders, they have some stuff in them, everything but services. Let's start with services because it's empty. Services is basically just a place for you to throw stuff and then make it available throughout your app. So if you have like a function that's handy, or a big glob of functions that are handy, you can toss them in this folder. Usually you name them stuff like user service or like login service, and then you can access that wherever you want. We're not going to be using those too much, mainly because we're going to use something called machines, which I'll talk about more in a bit. There's also this policies folder in here. So policies is a folder of functions, right? And so it's kind of like controllers. The way that these functions are set up look really similar. And it's just express middleware, if you're familiar with that, or connect middleware. And the rec and res are actually pretty much just like what you'd see in any vanilla Node.js example. But the point of these things is to be able to chain them together and protect your actions. So it's a really nice way to keep your not your authentication, but your protection logic, your access control logic, separate from your other code. Finally, responses is basically everything you see in here: not found, bad requests, OK, server error. You can call res, res dot, and whatever the name of the file is, minus the .js, and it's a function that is what you call like a terminal function, right? It ends the request. So this is ways for you to respond, right? Like if someone sends a request to you and says, "I want more water," and you're like, "No, get out of town. I'm all out of water. Too bad." You just say res.bad request, right? Or maybe if you're all out of water, you say res.not found. Or if they also grabbed your butt, you say res.server error, and that's the end of it. So that's kind of the idea. If you're not really sure how to feel about it, you can say res.negotiate, and it'll just sort of figure it out and make a best guess. I usually just do that. OK, so that's the API folder. That's backend code, right? There's only one other folder of what you might consider pure backend code, and that's the config folder. And most of this stuff isn't even really as much code as, or imperative logic. It's declarative. It's configuration. So you can see there's all kinds of stuff in here. They're here so that you can quickly change stuff, and you can see examples of how it works. Like just to pick one randomly, I'll go to CSRF. So if you want to turn on cross-site request forgery protection, you can go in here and you just uncomment this line and set it to true. The commented out stuff is the default. It's kind of like Apache configuration. There is one special one to pay attention to here, which is called Bootstrap. And Bootstrap is a function that runs when you lift the server, right? We could have called it like on lift or before lift or something. What's really important to remember in here is that you have to call callback, this little CB thing, or your server will never start and it'll get angry at you for taking too long. So just to get the point across here, and also for us to start like writing our first Node.js code in the context of a sales app, at least in this course, we'll do a log in here and say like hello, and then let's do 1 plus 9 modulo 30, right? Let's just do some stuff and see what happens. So we'll lift the server again. We should see a log, and hopefully we see a log. And yeah, indeed, apparently the answer to that math problem is 10. So cool. We don't need that in there right now, but the reason I'm showing you this is a really handy place to make sure that you have some data, right? So for instance, I might want to do this and create a emoji with text equal to that, because I want to make sure that at least the basics are there from the beginning. And let's maybe do, we can actually either specify an object here, or we can specify an array of objects. And actually, what waterline, the ORM in Sails, it stands for Object Relational Mapping, which is a terrible name for anything, so just ignore that. What matters is it's the thing that lets you talk to the database. And it'll actually support both of these use cases. So there's the one object, there's the array of objects, and if the adapter supports it, right, the thing that connects your database to the Sails app, if that supports create each, which is just a function that you can implement in that adapter, then this is going to actually be optimized at the database level. So it's only going to run one SQL query, for instance, if we were using MySQL. So okay, cool. We'll throw happy face, sad face, and then maybe like confused face as well. And so if you were working in a language that wasn't JavaScript, this would kind of be all you would need to do, right? But seeing as this is JavaScript, we're not done. We have to basically attach a callback. So this is nothing's happened yet. And the way that you kind of run this thing is you call .exec. If you like promises, there's another way to do this, but I'm not going to cover that right now just to keep it focused on the kind of the core stuff. If you were using promises, you would use .then. But we're going to use .exec for right now. And you're going to see this a lot in Sails and in any Node app in general, which is this callback that has this peculiar function signature, meaning this is the function signature here that is error and then result. So this first thing, like if it's there, if it's truthy, like present, it's going to mean that something weird happened and something went wrong, right? So if error, then we can handle it. Otherwise, we can do an else, and we can handle the success case. So that's, let's take a look at where we're at right now. If this is important, if you have not done this before, but imagine just for a second, right? Imagine that this is something like jQuery.fadein, and think about what would happen. Like, when does this function run, right? Like, if this was an alert, this is actually going to run before any of this happens, right? And that's really important, because this is what when people talk about this being asynchronous, all it means is that whatever comes after, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's like later in time. In JavaScript, time moves horizontally. It moves to the right? So you have this kind of like, in here, this is later in time. This is a different world, right? This is a future. So that's the future. And so the reason I'm pointing this out is we need to move this thing that we thought was going to happen later, and we need to put it in the future, because right now it's going to happen before the future. So we put it in here. Let's put it in this else. And we can't do alerts, right? So we're going to just switch this back to what it was, which is CB. That's saying go ahead and finish lifting Sails, continue, right? But more importantly, it just means something happened. Let me show you what happens if we don't call CB. So this is it worked. This is it did not work. OMG. error. And yeah, so let's try that. I'm going to change this back so we don't freak anybody out, including myself. So we'll do emoji.create and take a look. So we'll lift the server. It worked, but Bootstrap is taking unusually long to load. Things are short-circuiting. Everyone's freaking out. And if you notice, if I try to hit my local server, nothing is going to happen because the server is not lifted yet, because I never called the callback. So if I go in here, I need to call the callback. I need to call it in both cases, actually, right? I need to call it up here. But if this happens, what does that even mean, right? If there's an error creating these emoji, it means that something terrible went wrong in between the database and the app. If for instance, we had a uniqueness constraint, if we said that there could only be one happy face in the entire system, then that could cause an error, right? And that would mean that this would happen. So if that happens, we're actually going to say, you know what, let's just not start the server. And the way we do that is we pass an error to this callback, and that tells Sails, OK, something went wrong. I'm just going to spit this out. So let's make sure that that worked. Back to the console, we're going to run Sails lift. We hit Control-C to get out of that madness. Sails lift. OK, it worked, it says, and then it lifted Sails. And just to double check, back here in the browser, it's still there. All the sad faces are there. And you notice that it's actually, also created some happy faces. So if we go back in here one more time, I want to try throwing a few other things at you. This is, notice how this logic and this logic never happen together, right? That's because they're effectively, if this is the future, then these are parallel universes, right? Where this will run or this will run and they'll never cross paths again. So another way you can represent that same thing is by doing this, by making an error function and then making a success function. And this works in Waterline today. It's sort of experimental in Waterline. But when we start working with some of the other stuff you're going to see later, you'll see this come up more and more often. And I know it's sort of in a weird state right now, but it's coming back to order. There we go. And if there was an error, then that happens. And so you can kind of see, now you can really see that there are two futures. There's not one future, right? There are two futures. There's a future where this happened and there was an error, the bad future. And then there's also the good future where everything worked. And we don't even care about the result, right? We could just get rid of that if we wanted to. But it's oftentimes helpful to know that there was a result. So let's see if that works. If we run Sails lifts, chances are everything's fine. It worked, awesome, and we're in business. So we're not going to do that again with Waterline in this app, just because we're going to keep focused on what you're going to see most of the examples for. But it's a good thing to know. We're also not even going to mess with any of this right now, but I'll leave it in here commented out. And if I do that, think about what'll happen. It's just going to sit there and hang forever the next time I lift. So I'm going to put CB. We're good to go. And we'll just double check one time. Control-C, Sails lift, good to go. OK, so next thing, we have our app up here on Heroku, which was super easy to do. It's a great way to get something online, also free. And if you want to use other hosts in the same way, you could do it with any app, any Node app. You can take it and deploy it. We actually have some experimental support for Azure built in. If you run Sails deploy in the latest code from GitHub, that'll be in a subsequent version. We want to make it so that you can actually quickly deploy to any platform. But as you saw, it wasn't so bad to do like it is now. Right. So the next thing we're going to do is dig into what a database even is and where we've been storing this stuff. So it's kind of the big mystery so far. And if you look in the if you ls in your app and you just look around, you pretty much see what we've seen so far. There is one other folder, which is important, which is this .temp folder. It's hidden. And there's two things in there we care about right now. There is a file called local disk DB, and then there's a folder called public. So if you look at public, actually, let's try it from here, lsla.temp public. You can see that actually there's stuff in there that looks a lot like the assets folder, and that's because it is the stuff from the assets folder. It's getting synced in there, kind of using the rsync sort of strategy from Grunt, and or by Grunt, right? From the assets folder. This is what lets you do things like compile CoffeeScript, compile less, pre-process, minify, etc. So no big deal, we'll stay out of there. One thing, if you're using Sublime, you can actually configure it so it doesn't, when you hit Command P, which you might have seen me doing before, if I type Command P and I start typing emoji, I see all these matches. It's real annoying if I type Command P SPA and it's showing me both the one in my assets folder and the one in my temp folder. You can just Google around a little bit, not too hard to configure. And totally worth it. If you're interested, I can dig into that in the Q&A. Okay, so the other thing, though, in this folder is this temp public. One other hotkey thing while we're at it. You notice how I can jump to the beginning and the end of this line in the terminal? I'm doing that with Control-A and Control-E. And actually, you'll find this works in a lot of places, even in the URL bar in Chrome. So it's a handy thing to know. It works in the JavaScript console in Chrome, the inspector. It's a keyboard shortcut that came from Emacs, but it works in the command line. So I'll get rid of the LA here, and I'm going to look at local disk DB. So lo and behold, this is where the actual data is being stored. This JSON is effectively like our database right now. We could take this, put it in MySQL, put it in Mongo, put it in Postgres, put it in Redis, put it in Oracle, put it in Microsoft SQL, put it in OrientDB, RethinkDB, you get the idea. But right now we're going to put it in Mongo. So in order to do that, we don't really care about keeping it, so we don't have to delete it, we'll just ignore it, right? And I'm going to configure my app to work with Mongo. So first things first, I'll commit this because I have some other changes. So I'm going to mention dinking around with the bootstrap function and adding a schema to our emoji model. All right, and then I'm going to run that, which is just another one of my aliases that does git push and git push tags. Here it doesn't matter, we don't have any tags. For NPM modules, it's pretty handy. Okay, so if I want to hook up Mongo, the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that I have Mongo running locally. So I'm going to open up a new tab in my terminal with Command-T, and I'm going to type MongoD, or Mongod, as some people like to call it. And that's it. It doesn't look like it's doing anything, but it totally is. Just trust me. So I'm going to switch back to my other tab with Command-Shift-Left curly brace, and I'm going to open up my app again. I already have it open. I'm going to go to connections.js in the config folder. So this is another kind of thing you can configure. You can see there's a bunch of help explanation there, but what you're going to see in here is like all these different databases you could connect to. There's local disk DB, which is the thing we've been using, a MySQL server, a Mongo server, and that's what we want, right? Okay, cool. By default, it's actually already hooked up. So we can just close that, and we'll go to models.js, hook up this thing here. Instead of local disk DB, we're going to use local MongoDB, and we should probably name our connection the same thing. By default, it's just named some MongoDB server. So we did that. Now if we open up the terminal again and we lift our app, oops, let me go back to my other tab. Control-C to kill it, lift the app. Now the data is going to be hooked up to Mongo, but I get stopped because I don't have the Mongo adapter. So I just read what it says and I copy and paste what it says, and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to add -- save so that it'll get added to my package.json file automatically. And this is handy because when you run npm install, like if you're going to clone this repo later from GitHub, you're going to want to run npm install manually. Npm install looks at the package.json file and it says, hey, I need to figure out what is in here and I need to install for these guys, but I don't see Sails Mongo, so it would crash. What that -- save does is add it to this little list of things so that in a second when it's done, yeah, we have Sails Mongo. So now I should be able to lift. I'll make it further. This is connecting to my local Mongo database, which I have running over here in this tab. And if I open up the thing, the browser, I can see I have nothing because I haven't added anything yet. But if I look at my emoji and I create one with a sad smiley face or a sadness face, there it is. And you'll notice that the IDs in Mongo are different, right? So what's actually happening behind the scenes is Sails is kind of or Waterline rather, and specifically the Mongo adapter is marshalling this, meaning it's transforming it, changing it to be this string thing. Okay, great. Let's get that on the server. So all I have to do is publish that to Heroku by pushing it up to my branch on GitHub. So I'm going to add Mongo support. And I'm going to push that up. And I think it might just work. So if I go to emobook.herokuapp.com, there's some new stuff. You can see we wiped the list. And actually, this should not work, should it, right? Because we don't have a Mongo database set up on Heroku. I think, yeah, why don't use MongoDB exactly? So we can get a Mongo database on Heroku. We're going to do this real quick. We're going to get some add-ons. We're going to grab any one of these will do, but Mongo Lab is the closest to the left. So we'll grab the free one. And it wants me to log in again, even though I'm already logged in. So what's up with that? Add sandbox for free. Awesome. So now we have Mongo. We'll go back to our app in Heroku. And once we're back on our app, you can see now Mongo Lab is sitting there. If we look at our settings under environment variables, or they're called config variables, but what they are is environment variables, you can see they're using Mongo Lab URI and then this crazy Mongo URL. So I can just do this locally, right? They let you connect to it from anywhere. So I can actually connect, and you guys can't too, so be nice. But you can connect to it just by setting that and then hitting space and running Sails lift. And what that's going to do is actually nothing because we haven't made it do anything. So we'll go back to Sublime. We'll go to connections here. And I'm going to comment out the host and the port. I'm going to type URL, and then I'm going to use process.env.that, Mongo Lab URI. So that's actually, the Mongo adapter already supports this idea of using a URL. So I just have to do that, and this is no longer my local MongoDB. This is the Mongo Lab MongoDB. And we need to save models.js. We'll name it here as well. And keep in mind, this is going to crash if we don't set this environment variable. So it's no longer going to lift, at least for right now, if you're doing this, if you have it cloned locally, unless you specify that URL. But if I look at localhost 1337, now if I create a thing, you can see that thing I just created actually that's stored in the Mongo database. So now that we have that configured, I can configure for Mongo Lab, push that up, and when it redeploys, it'll now be using MongoDB on the server. So emoji. Someone's asking why I don't use Mongoose. You can actually use Mongoose with Sails if you want. Waterline does a lot of the same things, and it means that your app can also support any database instead of just Mongo, which is nice. A lot of times, actually, different models in your app will support different databases. But you can actually use Mongoose directly if you want, just require it like any other module. But the the thing to keep in mind is that if you make that choice and kind of step away from the affordance that Waterline gives you, you can end up in a place where suddenly you need to make a switch to a SQL database, and you're going to have to write that code over from scratch. So at least try Waterline first and go in the way that makes the most sense. All right, so if we go back to emobook.herokuapp.com, and there it is. Cool. So we'll look at the list of emoji. They're in Mongo. They're running on the actual server. We don't need this local Mongo anymore, so I'm going to kill it with Control-C. And I think that gets us a little bit closer. So now we've done the tour. We've deployed to a real database. We're almost ready for production. One other, last couple of notes, and we'll do this real quick right when we come back from the next break. But there's going to be a need to basically go into the sockets and set up a Redis, and go into this session and set up a Redis. And that Redis database is going to allow us to take that little knob we saw over on Heroku, or the little slider, and crank that up as high as we want, and your app will scale, right? So you can take this, throw it onto 100,000 concurrent users, and you should be okay. And you kind of have, and I say that with as if I had anything to do with that. Really what it is we're relying on the already great quality code that's built into Express by TJ and Doug, and the stuff that Guillermo's done for Socket.io, and specifically the Socket.io Redis adapter. So we'll do that right after the next break.